Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Steering Success in Greater China, Executive Insights into Achieving Growth and Market Confidence. Uncertainty continues to be the name of the game for the economy in 2024. And with global activity remaining slow, financial conditions remaining tight, and geopolitical risks continuing, volatility is likely to remain this year. The business landscape in Greater China is poised for further evolution. These complexities demand that C-suite reassess their strategies, especially in identifying priorities, making crucial decisions, nurturing top talents, and fostering high-performing teams. In response, PageGroup has conducted an exclusive C-suite confidence survey in which we interviewed executives in Greater China to find out their views and strategies to tackle challenges and capture growth. Today, we share with you our comprehensive insights. We hope it will serve not just as a reflection of current market sentiments, but also as a pivotal guide in shaping your business and talent strategies this year and beyond. So today we join forces with the Economist Intelligence Corporate Network to host this webinar. Firstly, Rupert Forster, PageGroup's Senior Managing Director of Greater China, will share our latest findings on C-suite confidence in Greater China's economy, where they see the opportunities and challenges, and what are the talent strategies leaders will focus on. After that, Edward Chu, the Hong Kong Director at EICN, will share an in-depth overview of today's macro economy. Edward is the corporate advisor who provides expert guidance to esteemed business leaders in Hong Kong and the Chinese mainland. Before the end of the session, we will have 15 minutes to answer any questions you may have, so please do add these to the chat box. So without further ado, let's welcome Rupert.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be taking you through the results of our survey, these C-suite insights relating to confidence levels and the mindsets of C-suite executives in the Greater China region. If we go to the next slide, please, Alan. We're going to split this down into 4 areas. We're going to look at their sentiment and confidence levels overall. We're going to look at their attitude towards goals they've set themselves and how they achieve those goals, the leaders that they're going to use to achieve these goals. And we'll look briefly at what's on their mind with regards to talent strategy in particular. And finally, we'll have a closer look at the Greater Bay Area as a destination for investment for both business and talent. So the next slide really is an introduction to how we've collected this data. So let me explain our approach. This is the second time that we've conducted this survey. The first time was at this time last year, where we conducted it purely for mainland China. It was very successful, so this year we've expanded it to the whole Greater China region. Now, we call it a survey. Really, it was a series of one-on-one in-depth interviews with 277 business leaders in the region, predominantly in the private sector. That cohort represented both foreign multinational firms as well as domestic firms, both in mainland Hong Kong and Taiwan. And it represents a pretty broad range of industries, as well, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide there. This qualitative approach is really an insider's look at not just sentiment and confidence, but really what is the current mindset of these C-suite executives. To give you a little bit more detail, about 93% of the respondents were C-level, 7% were senior functional heads. And of the total cohort, about 38% were either CEO, managing director, or GM level. About 60% of the respondents were based in the mainland, 25% in Hong Kong, and the remainder, just under 10%, in Taiwan. So that's a little bit of an overview on the work we've done to collect these insights. Now we'll start to move on to the section around their sentiment and confidence levels. Next slide, please, Alan. Thank you. So let me break down this slide in a bit of detail. Like I mentioned, we conducted the same exercise last year just for mainland. And one of the questions we asked them was about their confidence levels for both their industry, but also their own company. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, last year's results in mainland, executives were scoring the prospects for their own industry at 6.1 out of 10. Whilst for their own company, 6.3, so slightly more positive on that. It's worth noting that, like I said, last year was the first time we conducted this. At the time, if we'd have conducted this same exercise in 2021, or even pre-pandemic, we'd have expected those numbers to be higher. So we could obviously see in the latter half of 2022 and early 23, sentiment was somewhat subdued looking towards the next 12 months. Now, when we compare mainland results from last year to today, you can see at the top of that bottom right-hand corner, you can see that there's been a marginal improvement in sentiment. For industry prospects, it's moved from 6.1 to 6.5 out of 10. For one's own company, from 6.3 to 7.1. And that marginal improvement in sentiment probably reflects two things. It's a acceptance of the current market conditions may be here for some time, and also a growing confidence in one's own response to those conditions and initiatives they've put in place to ensure performance. In Hong Kong, you can see that sentiment levels for individuals, industries, as well as companies are a little bit more aligned. So it's worth noting that potentially in mainland, individuals have got greater confidence in their own ability to perform in what is more of a bear market. So that's a little bit about the overall confidence. If we go to the next slide, this really digs into those respondents that showed positive sentiment for their own industry. So that scores of an 8 or higher also had an amplified response to positivity for the prospects for their own company. Moving on to the next slide, again, this looks at that population that were more positive on their scores. You can see that in technology as an industry, confidence for both the industry and one's individual company were more aligned, whereas there was a greater gap in those confidence levels for other industries like banking and financial services, industrial markets, and consumer, for example. So a little bit more of a gap there in executives' attitudes towards confidence for my business versus my industry overall. Thank you, Alan. So that concludes the section around overall confidence. Next, we start to look at executives' attitudes towards their plans for the short to medium term. So in this slide, we asked them about what is their business strategy over the next 12 months. And we can see that 56% plan to scale up, whether that's locally or whether that's abroad, with 23% really favoring cost savings and improving efficiency as a way to drive results. It's also worth noting that despite a lot of negative headlines in the press globally about this region, that only 3% cited that they plan to transfer business operations elsewhere. On the next slide, it provides more detail on this question around their business strategy in 2024. And we can see that generally priorities are aligned. Scaling up locally is the main priority. Cost savings and driving efficiencies is also pretty aligned. But unsurprisingly, on the scaling up overseas, we can see that when we're interviewing executives in the region that work for domestic firms, that really is much more of a focus now, overseas investment opportunities to scale. We also asked them where they plan to scale up locally, and this was pretty clear that East China and then the Greater Bay Area were consistent priorities, and our executives cited access to talent, established supply chains, as well as government policy as drivers for this. And when we asked them where they plan to scale up globally, on the next slide, you can see that Southeast Asia really stands out as a destination of choice, unsurprising, followed closely by Europe, the rest of Asia, and North America. And it's worth noting, I think, that the Middle East certainly is one to watch. Just for our own business, we see a lot more activity between the Greater China region and the Middle East over the last 12 months or so. We also asked them about how they plan to save costs and improve efficiency. Generally, the foreign multinationals and domestic firms were aligned that organizational optimization, right sizing of operations and headcount, whilst investing in technology and R&D were standout opportunities. For those two groups, they differed slightly on other priorities. For example, the domestic firms favoring employee training and development as a lever to drive efficiency, whereas the foreign multinationals were more focused on supply chain optimization. So some slight differences in attitudes there. We asked our executives, what do they see as their top 3 priorities for growth over the next 12 months? And in the next slide, you can see technology advancement again, investment in R&D, sales and marketing, investment there, and driving costs were the main levers, closely followed by talent strategy, because obviously with all of these programs, you need good people to deliver them well. We also asked them, what are your top 3 opportunities for business development? And really what came out of this is that despite challenges, there is no denying, and there's an acceptance and acknowledgement that Greater China is still a very large market and a huge opportunity for companies. So that hasn't gone away, and it's not going to go away. There was a focus on industry upgrading, and really the way I would describe that from the interviews, it's the realization that the market's matured very quickly in the region compared to what it was 5 years ago. And with that, for companies to thrive in the future, companies need to create even more value. And there's a realization of this from executives and obviously a focus on that. And then the third one was obviously overseas market expansion, which, as I mentioned earlier, very much front of mind with the domestic firms. Beyond these top 3 opportunities, there were some structural opportunities as well. For example, policy support, also improved consumer confidence being cited as opportunities for developing their businesses. So that was the overview on business development. And generally this next slide illustrates some differences, some subtle differences again between our domestic respondents and our foreign multinational respondents. As I said, with domestic firms favoring the overseas market expansion, with the foreign firms, executives in situ really focusing on their market and growing locally. So we'd expect that. Then we asked them about what are the top challenges that they see over the next 12 months. And again, they were very aligned on this. Increased competition, which is reflective of a maturing, more sophisticated market. Costs and controlling those. The overall economic environment, again, closely followed by talent. This theme kept coming up. And in the next slide, we talked to them about what do they see as their top long-term goals that they want to focus on in the next 3 to 5 years. Expansion of their existing businesses, development into new markets, including overseas markets, as well as product innovation and R&D. And then about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 respondents were either citing that specifically that overseas expansion opportunity or investment in talent, but they were the main themes. So that concludes the section that looks at the levers for delivering their goals. In the next section, we'll look a little bit closer at talent and their attitudes towards that. Thanks, Alan. So we asked them, what are your talent priorities in 2024? And the way we've structured the answers to this is around our talent quotient, which is how we tend to look at talent in Page, talent attraction, employee experience, company culture, and talent retention. And there's 3, I suppose, standout areas that our executives see as priorities. There's obviously retaining their core talent. but also in talent attraction, almost half are looking at that. And this is really the theme around, in a more complex market, leadership is never more at a premium at all levels. Individuals that can really make a difference to an organization. And we see that played out in the answers here. And finally, in company culture, you can see that 36% for employee efficiency. That really stood out as well. What do we mean by employee efficiency? The way I read it through the interviews was very much about, in a more challenging environment, these executives need employees, they need teams that are positive, are decisive, and can get stuff done. And that really came through in the conversations. We talked to them about their plans for headcount changes. Almost half of businesses plan to increase headcount. That would, of course, reflect both headcount expansion in the Greater China region, but also overseas as well. So that would be factored into that 46%. 36% looking to maintain headcount, only 18% looking to reduce headcount. You can also see bottom left there how that plays out in the mainland versus Hong Kong. Sorry, we don't have the data on here for Taiwan, but the sample wasn't quite big enough. On the next slide, we asked them about their reasons for headcount changes. And really, it was down to growth opportunities, whether that was growing their existing businesses organically, whether it was new markets or overseas growth. That was really the theme. And then we also dug deeper into what functions they expect to invest in headcount, and perhaps what functions they're looking to right size. Again, no surprises here. Looking to invest in commercial functions, sales, marketing, in technical functions, all the things that ultimately drive customer engagement. And there was a trend, unfortunately, that in the current environment, companies are looking to right size and save costs in support functions and back office functions. So no surprises there, but you've got the data nonetheless. On the next slide, we talked about what are the top competencies that our executives are looking for in talent. And this was very aligned for both types of organization. The most valued leadership competencies, problem-solving skills, and a good mindset. And interestingly, they also came up in the top 5 competencies that they feel they might be lacking at the moment. So again, this all feeds into that slide earlier that talks about attraction of top talent that can really make a difference to one's organization. So that concludes a little bit about what's on their minds when it comes to talent. Finally, I'd like to move to the final part of the deck where we look a little bit more detail at the Greater Bay Area as an opportunity for these executives and their businesses. So we asked them, do they plan to develop or explore markets in the GBA? 43% said that they do intend to invest or invest further in this region. And you can see on the bottom right, the top industries that are investing, led by banking and financial services. We also asked them about, do they plan to hire in the Greater Bay Area? And the vast majority do. You can see there 71% of companies overall, with consumer, industrial, and again, banking and financial services leading that. When we got into why they're looking to hire in this region, there was a slight difference. Hong Kong firms were more focused on new business opportunities and growth opportunities, whereas the mainland firms were more focused on both the market opportunity, but also the policy support opportunities that they see as their rationale for investing. And we dug deeper to look at what functions they're looking to hire in the region. Again, the same trend plays out. They're looking to invest in commercial functions predominantly and technical functions that drive customer engagement. Some, but less so, looking at more of the support and group services functions. We also asked them about what they saw as their top challenges when hiring in the GBA. And again, it's the same trends that play out across the region. It's competition for top talent, which is a trend we see everywhere. And it comes back to this point that leadership more than ever is at a premium, regardless of what level in the organization we look at. Securing those people or retaining those people that as individuals really make a difference. And that's going to be an ongoing theme as we see it. So that's a little bit on the GBA. The way I would summarize the findings from the report, like I said, these senior people are rationally but cautiously optimistic about the next 12 months, reflecting their acceptance of the current market and growing confidence in their own responses to the challenges they faced. There's a focus on delivering growth, particularly bottom line growth, partially through cost saving. And then talent strategy really underpins all of this in delivering these programs. And finally, the last point, of course, the emergence of the Greater Bay Area as an opportunity that's gaining momentum for these executives. So that concludes my overview on the report. If you want to access the report, please feel free to scan the QR code you can see there, so you can read that in a bit more detail in your own time. I hope you found it useful. One last point, that if you would like a deeper conversation, please do email us. We'd be happy to give you a one-on-one briefing to understand more about what these trends and opportunities mean for your organization. And then lastly, I'm delighted to hand over to Edward Chu, who's director in Hong Kong at the Economist Intelligent Corporate Network. Thank you, Edward. Over to you.
Thank you, Rupert. Good morning, everyone. That was a very insightful presentation. Well, I will be presenting a sort of more macro outlook in terms of what's going on a global and a regional basis, as well as take a look at sort of the geopolitical atmosphere that we're experiencing today. My name is Edward. As Rupert mentioned, I am with the Economist Intelligence Corporate Network, based out of Hong Kong here. And before I start, I often like to start with a quote that I think best sort of sums up what's going on in the world today. It's a quote by Lenin that says, "There are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen." And in this particular slide, we're a component of the Greater Economist Group, of which you're probably most familiar with, The Economist magazine. And I wanted to sort of use this slide as a demonstration of sort of the key themes that we were looking at last year, and certainly looking ahead for this year as well. You can see here that, certainly the conflict in the Middle East is going to have repercussions throughout the year as well, not just for that region, but for the world. We've got climate change. COP28 ended last November in Dubai, and they made a commitment to transition away from fossil fuels. So the never-ending sort of discussion on climate change is ongoing. AI certainly has come onto the scene in a very sort of big way. Its emergence has caused a lot of discussion in boardrooms throughout. For us at The Economist, we see the biggest impact being in elections for this year. Over half the world is going to experience elections, more than half the global population, which is the most ever. And we think with regards to what we've seen with regards to social media in past elections, AI is going to take that a step further. And so we think the greatest impact is going to be in that realm. Clearly, we've been living in a high inflationary environment on a global basis. And with that comes higher interest rates. And I'll discuss that a little bit later, but that's clearly a big issue across boardrooms around the world. We've got the deteriorating tensions and relations between America and mainland China. And certainly a focus on the domestic economy for mainland China as well has been an ongoing area of focus for us. And of course, the Ukraine conflict now nearing the second year and going into the third just next month is certainly something also that has had repercussions going with regards to commodities and knock-on effects towards inflation, and with that, as I mentioned before, interest rates. Next slide, please. But let's start with how the global economy is looking. These are sort of the 5 areas that are a bit more optimistic than we had been expecting for the global economy compared to this time last year, for example. We found that economies, especially in the US, in the West, have been certainly more resilient than we had sort of forecast. It's gone through a number of iterations due to the heightened expectations, then the lowered forecast of China from last year, but still looking okay. So in the first box on the upper left, the global economy, as I mentioned, has been relatively resilient, and we're not expecting recessions in the US or the EU for the remainder of this year, going perhaps into next as a forward-looking forecast. But we do expect global economic growth to slow, reflecting persistent headwinds stemming from the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine, as well as still high inflation and interest rates. This means that inflation is not going to go away anytime soon. We're expecting an era of higher for longer, and interest rates are going to remain high in that capacity. So that means pressure on markets. It means pressure on funding. It means a higher cost of capital and an era, as I mentioned, as higher for longer, which we see coming down next quarter or going into Q3. In the next box, global inflation will ease only gradually, and I'll delve into that a bit later. In the upper right, we see that people are still spending, which I think has been heartening in terms of our global forecasts as well. Labor markets in the US and Europe have been pretty robust and more resilient than anticipated, with higher levels of employment and high levels of wage growth. So households have been very willing to sort of spend to stave off global recessionary fears. Consumption is a little bit weaker in Asia, but we're seeing pockets of recovery and resiliency. And so with that, in box number 4, a big item on our agenda is this idea of geopolitics and protectionism. So whether it's in the name of national security or ideology, or even decoupling, which is a buzzword, or even de-risking is something we've heard a lot about, especially in terms of political rhetoric over the past year. We're seeing ultimately policy measures meant to restrict trade on strategic resources, or even the weaponization of industries, including in finance and tech. We've got just today members of TikTok and Facebook, for example, at congressional hearings. And geopolitics ultimately is a driver of all of that. We've seen, obviously, the politicization, as I mentioned, of Chinese tech companies in AI, quantum computing, and also other data privacy protectionist measures. So all sorts of governments are using regulation as a business tool, regulation of business, as a tool of geopolitics. So most significantly, we see the strong demand for semiconductors lead to policy decisions on a national and coordinated global level. And as I mentioned, of course, China's consumption is recovering, but slowly. The industrial sector is improving. Retail sales, you can divide them across different categories, but ultimately losing steam for this year. Property, of course, remains the biggest drag. And growth tied to services rather than goods is a trend that we're seeing, especially for this year. Next slide. And the next one over. So generally with these types of presentations, especially as we're part of the Economist Group, we start with the macroeconomy. But I think a lot of the triggers that we're seeing in the world today with regards to geopolitics necessitates that we sort of look at that from a macro perspective first, because the sort of implications of what's happening in different parts of the world has obviously a major impact on businesses both afar and here in this part of the world. This is our global risk heat map, I would say. These aren't things that have necessarily transpired, but things that corporate executives need to sort of take into account as they look and sort of plan on a forward-thinking basis, on a strategic basis as well. So what are the sort of global risk scenarios that we're seeing? Well, this map demonstrates, across political, military, economic, and environmental themes. And so, as I mentioned, there are clearly deteriorating ties between China, mainland China, and the EU and the US. We've got inflation easing quite rapidly, so that we anticipate will help boost economic growth more towards the latter part of this year. We've also got more from this time last year, this fear of sort of financial sector contagion. And so, again, as we're in a higher inflation rate era, this is going to have an outsized impact. And so we're certainly keeping an eye on if there are areas such as Silicon Valley Bank, what transpired with them last year, if that would, continue to happen in other parts of the world with other banks as well. Concern over the war in Ukraine, drawing in sort of NATO members and making this sort of a more global conflict as well. We've got, as I mentioned, a big year in terms of elections, so political risks tied to that in places like Taiwan, Indonesia, Korea, Singapore, and Japan is something certainly we are keeping an eye on. I think probably the two biggest elections on the calendar are what's happening in India and obviously in November with the U.S. presidential elections. Other areas to consider include sort of, again, high inflation, extreme weather concerns, which are going to disrupt sort of supply chains, commodity prices, and so on and so forth. Next slide. As the Israel-Hamas war continues now into its fourth month, I believe, there is growing sense of unease among sort of the international community, and for good reason. So the conflict has been far from contained to the Gaza Strip, has thus far been contained. And so we are seeing elements of it expand into areas like the Red Sea with the Houthi attacks. But in terms of our particular forecast, a restrained conflict remains our central scenario for the moment. So we expect a conflict limited to existing fears, although some events, if left unchecked, could move it into a conflict in the direction of a multi-front war. So, certainly different scenarios as you see in this chart, but in terms of immediate effects, shipping prices will continue to spike as a result of what's happening there, as well as in the Red Sea, as we've seen in recent weeks. And global freight prices are now at their highest levels in almost 2 years. Next slide. With everything going on in the world, I think the big sort of question to ask is whether increased U.S.-China tensions will derail the Asian century, which seems like a bold statement, but you do hear a lot of talk, for example, about decoupling, de-risking, bifurcation. So while not something that's going to happen overnight, there's some $650 billion worth of trade between the U.S. and China. That would be a huge economic dislocation should that be sort of unraveled overnight, and not something necessarily on anyone's genuine agenda, I would say. But I think the thing to be really more concerned about from a business perspective would be the creation of kind of competitive blocks or the kind of unwinding of trade or supply chains, a type of systematic bipolarity, if you will, this pressure to sort of choose sides. So we've seen, especially in this part of the world, countries benefiting from its economic association with China, as well as protectionist measures from the U.S. And so, as things sort of move apart, countries are being asked to choose one side or the other. And this particular chart you see here demonstrates the leaning inclinations, I would say, of different countries. So bilateral pressure will continue to intensify with third countries sort of caught in the middle, having to choose sides. Technology obviously is one area which has sort of been caught as a result of sort of the rhetoric between the two sides. The end result would essentially lead to separate supply chains, different inputs and potential tariffs, as well as higher levels of inefficiencies and costs. So something certainly to be more cognizant about on a going forward level. Next slides. Next one, Ellen. Thank you. I'm going to take a look now at the economic outlook for the world, Asia and China, a little more specifically. So, as I mentioned, the global economy was certainly more resilient in 2023 than we had anticipated, but we do expect global economic activity to slow as the full impact of, aforementioned monetary tightening sets in. So, the global economic growth is forecasted to decelerate to 2.3% in 2024, down from about 2.5% last year. To put things into context, 3% is sort of what we would normally see in a more normalized year. So we're certainly far from 0%, and we're not too far from what would be considered a normal year. I think the global mood music that we're seeing from our members, from corporate boardrooms, and from consumers in general is a little more negative than I think what the numbers are showing. I call it a vibe session, where people are anticipating, I think, more negative going forward sentiment than what we're actually, again, seeing in terms of the actual data. So U.S. growth will slow but remain resilient enough to avoid a recession. There will be slightly stronger momentum in Europe, while moderate stimulus in China will help shore up its growth for the coming year. Again, momentum is only likely to build from the second half as we see interest rates spurred on by the Fed come down, and we anticipate perhaps a little closer than we had anticipated from the end of last year. We saw it coming down no earlier than the second half, but we might have an upside surprise going into Q2 this year, especially as interest rates support a modest recovery in consumption and investment as interest rates sort of come down across central banks around the world. Emerging markets will benefit from a reduction in investor uncertainty that, again, will come sort of with the conclusion of global monetary tightening. I would say, again, to sort of put things in sort of greater context, that global GDP from the early part of this decade, from 2020 until this year, is on track to suffer sort of the worst half decade of growth in 30 years. Obviously, a lot of that owing to what transpired during the sort of pandemic years. But the upside, perhaps no consolation for us as we are now in the beginning of the year, is that global growth is forecast to strengthen to about 2.7% on average for the next few years going through until the end of the decade, aided again by slow but persistent lowering of interest rates through monetary easing and future investment opportunities in technology and green energy as well. Next slide. We forecast that global GDP growth, again, will sort of slow. And so this particular map, this sort of colorful illustration, sort of shows a number of different key countries and key economies. What you see is in the upper left, in terms of sort of the aquas and the blues and the greens, those that are growing a little more slowly. So European growth only marginally improves, remain behind the US. In the sort of lower right hand, you see a lot more sort of reds, oranges, and yellows. And those are a lot of the countries here in Asia and in emerging economies. And we see growth improving in the developing world, held back, obviously, with regards to instability, debt, climate risks, spike in oil prices, from the Middle East, while they benefited in terms of their GDP during pandemic. What's transpiring now could lead could lead to a global recession on a going forward basis. China's economy is weak but stabilizing. And so, ultimately, there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of blue, as I mentioned, in Europe, where it's going to be, a little bit slower. I would say the war in Ukraine continues to curb growth in that area, particularly in Germany and Central Europe, where energy-intensive industries will struggle to remain competitive. I'll go into China in a little more depth shortly, but we saw in the past year, a lot of drags that are continuing into this year, especially with regards to an ailing real estate market, falling global demand for its exports, poor consumer confidence, and high debt levels. Sentiment, as sort of Rupert mentioned, plays a large part in terms of people's decision-making skills. So, people are cautiously optimistic, but again, there are a number of drags and headwinds going into this year that are sort of applying pressure in terms of the efficacy of policy, especially in mainland China. So we now expect growth to average about 4.5% to 5% per year for mainland China in the next couple of years. Next slide. So China's post-reopening recovery has fallen slightly short of expectations, despite we had sort of revised downward our expectation. Last year was sort of a tale of different quarters. With the reopening came a lot of positive sentiment, which quickly dissipated in Q2, but then stabilized towards the second half of last year. Ultimately, we see full year growth of about 5.2% going into 2024. 4.9% going into 2024. down from 5.2% from last year. This is slightly more optimistic than what we're seeing from other houses. The two sessions in March, we anticipate the CCP to again sort of estimate around the 5% range for this year. Ultimately, a return to pre-COVID growth will take longer than expected. Again, sources of stress relate to excess capacity in the manufacturing sector relative to what we're seeing with regards to soft demand, ongoing credit woes in the housing market, and the deleveraging of the household sector, subdued income growth, and elevated youth unemployment. So as we know, much of the sort of slowdown can be traced to China's property market. And while it did seem to be recovering, there is going to be prolonged pain in that sector, especially as news from earlier this week came out of Hong Kong in terms of liquidation for Evergrande. So as a final sort of headwind, overseas exports continue to struggle with tepid Chinese import demand and economic activity decelerating through, as I mentioned, the remainder of this year. We see this sort of proliferating in certain trends, including sort of a younger generation embracing sort of this line flat trend and special forces style travel where, and we see this in Hong Kong, where people are traveling. Domestic travel in China has been very robust, returning in some capacity to sort of pre-COVID numbers. But I think the overall spend, what you're seeing, is somewhat lower than what we were seeing earlier, and as a result, again, of sort of diminished sentiment going forward. But the upside is that demand for eating out, domestic travel, purchases of EVs is rising altogether. Next slide. While this does seem sort of negative, it is sort of testament to sort of the sentiment that we're seeing. But I think it's important to put things in perspective. Being in this part of the world, I think we're all very sort of fortunate, as Asia will contribute around 60% of global GDP growth. And of course, half of that is going to be driven by China. So there are certainly opportunities to be aware of, despite what seems like a lot of sort of negative sentiment. Asia will once again be the fastest growing region this year. The Chinese economy, which again accounts for half of that GDP, is rebounding, and this is sort of the main factor supporting a pickup of growth across Asia. We have lowered our forecast for regional GDP growth of 3.9% for this year, as the momentum coming out of China slows, but relative to sort of last year, we see it on a more stabilization course, I would say. As mentioned in sort of Rupert's presentation, foreign investors are not fleeing or exiting China. I think a lot of them are sort of pivoting their strategies altogether. They will remain cautious about new or expanding investment in the market. But again, you look at it from different pockets. GBA is a huge growth opportunity. So I think there's a pivot from sort of traditional areas into sort of new growth areas. And I think that's sort of to be expected from a strategic point of view. Geopolitical risks will fuel investment in supply chain diversification. Again, sort of a trend we're seeing towards areas like South and Southeast Asia, particular markets in Europe, and even in Latin America, Mexico also benefiting from sort of supply chain diversification. For a number of reasons, they want to avoid U.S. tariffs on China goods. They want to invest in factories offshore. In other areas, FDI takes into account sort of these China +1, +2 strategies that have been ongoing. It's just been accelerated through pandemic and through geopolitical tensions, and it's been ongoing even, before the pandemic. So we don't expect a corporate exodus from the China market. We do see this idea of investment on a dual basis, one for the domestic Chinese economy, and especially one for ex-China as well. And you see this especially in the realm of supply chains, dual supply chain circulation and diversification as well. So domestic private consumption will remain the main driving force of China's economy for this year, and the consumer recovery will primarily benefit domestic good producers and service suppliers. Next slide, please. So a beneficiary of China's woes is Southeast Asia, as I mentioned. As companies look to diversify their supply chain and manufacturing away from China, the FDI differential between China and ASEAN is narrowing. FDI flows into China did turn negative for the first time at the end of last year. And FDI data does suggest that foreign companies are withdrawing investments and are either repatriating them to home markets or redeploying them elsewhere. Although we expect foreign investment to eventually rebound this year, these flows will settle at lower levels comparable compared to pre-pandemic years. Again, geopolitics has played a major role as U.S.-China frictions will drive investment decisions as countries are asked to sort of choose sides. And if you're looking outside China, outside Greater China, in Southeast Asia, this particular chart shows some of the larger forward-thinking strategic infrastructure projects that a lot of Southeast Asia economies are partaking in. A quick word on tourism. The tourism recovery will also drive economic activity in ASEAN. And there's a slide later on to demonstrate that. Next slide. So a quick word on inflation. Asia is a little less affected by commodity price inflation than the rest of the world, primarily because it's not as exposed to the big spike in the price of gas. Risks to our inflation outlook are weighted somewhat to the upside, but we do hear obviously a lot of talk about how inflation has affected GDP, commodity prices, et cetera, cost of living in Europe, in the US the past couple of years. So US inflation was at around 3.2%. Last month, its smallest increase in 2 years. So we do see inflation having peaked from the end of last year. We do see it coming down to around the 2% level at the end of this year going into next. So, near sort of the target that G20 economies have set for themselves. China's also defied fears of becoming an inflationary force in the world as it reopened last year. We do see deflationary components coming into play, but we don't see it becoming the next Japan as some people may have feared sort of in the press. So as inflation continues to recede incrementally, it's not going to get down to the levels we saw, I would say, post Great Financial Crisis, about 10, 15 years ago, to the sort of 0.5 percentage point. So, as I mentioned, it is going to hit sort of around the 2% level. And so, while that's the stated goal, we have to continue to plan for the longer term higher cost of capital again. So this idea of an era of higher interest rates for longer, and that's going to impact sort of corporate bottom lines as well. Next slide. So future FDI flows to China will slow as international investment drops. It did fall shortly. I'm not going to go too much more into this, but data suggests foreign companies are withdrawing to a certain extent investments and are again sort of redeploying and repatriating them. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little more about sort of Greater China's consumer market. So overall, there are a number of trends we're seeing and are seeing develop with regards to supply chain shifts. Within sort of our member base here at the corporate network, among sort of the top 3 issues, this is one that probably senior executives and boards have true power over in terms of decision-making power. Supply chains is an important component. It's changed significantly, over the past few years for a variety of different reasons. And sort of these are sort of the trends that we're seeing. The most significant is a common theme that I've mentioned throughout this presentation. Geopolitical anxieties have and will continue to drive this level of diversification. The transition from a global economy from the past couple of decades to the current talk of de-risking is putting pressure on governments to diversify. The reality is that it's companies that are the main drivers of this level of diversification. So the rhetoric is really coming from government officials ultimately, but it's the companies that are sort of making these decisions based on what they see, best for themselves. And again, while we are seeing diversification away from China to a certain extent, I think it's important to note that China is an important component of the overall supply chain process. So it's never going to be extracted entirely from it. It is also moving more upstream in terms of the goods that it does manufacture. So it's always going to be a part of the overall story. It is somewhat of a gradual process, and so it's more a risk assessment on the part of different senior leadership in assessing whether to choose the anxiety over sort of geopolitical risk and security over efficiency and the repercussions over compliance tied to sort of export controls, sanctions, import bans, and tariffs. Again, I would say it's more nuanced and it's become more of a matter of dual supply chains, one for the mainland China market, and one for ex-China in terms of supply chains. Next slide. This chart simply shows which countries are sort of more reliant on trade as a component of their overall GDP. So again, going back to geopolitical risk, especially in this part of the world, economies that are more reliant on Chinese goods are also most exposed to geopolitical tensions. ASEAN will be the principal beneficiary of sort of this redrawn trade map, as trade with China will enjoy the highest incremental volumes. And so companies will continue to diversify through nearshoring, and friendshoring opportunities. We did come up here at The Economist a term called Alt Asia. This is sort of the emergence of an alternative Asian supply chain comprised of 14 Southeast Asian countries that are sort of collectively looking to compete with China. Obviously, if you look at the Philippines or Vietnam, or Malaysia, for example, they by themselves cannot compete with China. But taken collectively, Alt Asia, they are now seen collectively similar to EU as an entire bloc that, with regards to a young population demographic, in terms of investment, et cetera, will look to sort of compete over the next few years, if not decades, with regards to supply chain for the world. Next slide. So as China retail demand rebounds from 2023, we expect average private consumption growth over the next 4 years to trend below the sort of pre-pandemic 5-year average. It is recovering, but it's going to take a little bit longer than I think people anticipated. Consumers overall, what we've seen is they've adopted a more rational and value-driven approach with higher sales volumes not corresponding to a commensurate rise in sales value. One crucial determinant of the duration of this prudent spending behavior comes from the weakness in the labor market. As I mentioned, what you see in terms of increase in domestic travel and even travel to places here like Hong Kong is that it's recovered to a certain extent, but again, the overall spend that we're seeing, from these travels has been somewhat diminished relative to what we saw pre-pandemic. The unemployment rate is also of concern. It's decreased from a peak of about 6.2% from 2020 to about 5% from the end of last year. Across different demographics, it certainly is a tale of different stories. But one thing that we need to keep an eye on is sort of youth unemployment, which is now at around 15%, down from, I would say, 21% from the last released figures about 6 months ago. Next slide. Sort of a final word in terms of China as sort of a manufacturing base. Again, it's not going to be displaced as a manufacturing powerhouse. Western decoupling from China is sort of unrealistic as supply chains, are very sort of highly complex and sort of interconnected. China is actually gaining market share in global manufacturing by, again, moving up the supply chain to sort of more sophisticated products. It's demonstrated over the years an ability to overcome the impact of sort of technological restrictions that we're seeing, especially with regards to sort of semiconductors. The country's sort of vast manufacturing scale and well-established supply chains should lay a foundation for future technological innovation. It's shifted away from low-end labor-intensive component manufacturing to higher tech, full-spectrum product manufacturing. And what we're seeing is policy overall investment that does continue to exist in China, pivoting from more traditional levers like property over to areas such as semiconductors, AI, quantum computing, EVs, batteries, green technology. So these are the future growth opportunities that we're seeing in China. The growth that we saw that was, propagated by, development, those sort of heady days are over, but there are newer opportunities that are going to be future drivers for the Chinese economy on a going forward basis. Next slide. That said, I think it's important to sort of be aware again. This is why I'm sort of emphasizing and started off with the geopolitical climate. While there are new sort of growth opportunities, sentiment is sort of wavering at the moment, but people are still obviously going to be cautiously optimistic about what the future entails. It is important to recognize that fragmentation and regionalization will continue to be trends in the global political atmosphere. Geopolitical risk will encourage firms to revisit approaches to their supply chain and target markets, as we're seeing sort of this transition and diversification to other markets. And this is influenced increasingly by government policy. So worsening geopolitical tensions and conversations around de-risking are also reshaping regional capital flows. So China will continue experiencing declining inbound portfolio flows, and we expect inbound direct investment to be less than it had been before as supply chain realignment continues to drive corporate strategies. But next slide. As I mentioned, there are sort of growth opportunities, and this was touched upon by Rupert earlier. In terms of the Greater Bay Area, as we all know, it's a region comprised of 9 cities and 2 SARs. It's aiming to be an integrated economic area to rival other world-class clusters that we see in New York, in San Francisco, and in Tokyo. It's one of China's largest and wealthiest city clusters. It boasts a high standard of living, a large consumer base, highly skilled workforce, known entities in terms of the technology sector, making it an attractive base for foreign businesses, domestic mainland Chinese businesses, and their staff across different sectors from manufacturing, technology, finance, insurance, and healthcare, with favorable individual and corporate tax policies. For Hong Kong specifically, the government is prioritizing GBA schemes that help to open the mainland market for Hong Kong firms, improving cross-border transport links or local housing development. Reciprocal access to Hong Kong for mainland companies will be expected, but concern about the potential influx of mainland Chinese into Hong Kong with work visa schemes is ongoing. That said, moving forward, there is an effort to further deepen economic links via SEPA and sort of connect two-way security trading schemes. So, there are certainly a lot of expectations. Execution-wise, we're seeing a lot of companies sort of lay the groundwork as they anticipate future growth in this region. And CCP policy obviously is also focused on this part of mainland China. Next slide. For Hong Kong especially, I think one bright spot is this idea of new sort of mainland China, Hong Kong cross-border data transfer. These policies which happened, which were clarified earlier this month. The Hong Kong government jointly released with CAC new guidelines to facilitate the cross-border data transfer process between mainland China and Hong Kong. This has been an area of consternation for a lot of companies, especially multinational companies. This idea of cross-border transfer process has been quite cumbersome. And so this will be seen as a mild relaxation of China's cumbersome data regulatory regime. So the mainland's regulatory framework for cross-border data transfer again, is looking to sort of ease to make things easier. And so Hong Kong will be sort of a clear beneficiary. And companies based in the GBA, for example, can now transfer personal data from the mainland to Hong Kong with lower compliance costs. So we expect this streamlined process to benefit the data management and broader professional services. Asia-based multinational companies will have data needs for both mainland China and non-Chinese territories will be incentivized to put more of their business functions here in Hong Kong, where data from both sides can be handled. So that's certainly sort of a positive outlook. Next slide. The China's outbound tourism recovery will take a little bit longer to recover. We've seen easing curbs on group tours help to accelerate the recovery of global tourism. Visa restrictions have been dropped for a number of countries, and every day we hear of new countries where citizens of those territories can come to China and vice versa, in a more meaningful, easier fashion. We do see, again, sort of flight capacity having sort of recovered from a domestic capacity. So inbound travel is yet to see a similar recovery, and outbound tourism will not return sort of to pre-pandemic levels until later this year, early into next. Again, sort of the recovery sort of shows a lot of ongoing future promise as well. Next slide. So Hainan and its duty-free market is another potential opportunity. So aspirational luxury sales in China will remain in the domestic market. So there's been a focus on creating domestic luxury consumption hubs. Richemont and LVMH just in the past few weeks have shown really strong underlying results from last quarter. And Richemont, for example, has particularly said that China, Hong Kong, and Macau has been a great driver of all of that. So, again, when you talk about sort of negative sentiment in mainland China, there are demarcations across different segments. So, luxury goods, again, has sort of been a positive bright spot. And so with that, Hainan and its duty-free market are, growing opportunities to focus on that outsized spend. And I think a testament to that is DFS, for example, is looking to open up a 7-star luxury retail and entertainment destination in Sanya by 2026. And so it'll, look to remain competitive in that sort of high-end spend luxury market. Next slide. So I think sort of end the sort of presentation. One thing to sort of be aware of thematically overall is this idea of sort of decoupling. It doesn't, again, mean sort of an end to trade, but it does mean an increase in the level of barriers, an increase in sort of political risk on both sides of the fence. As you see in this particular chart, on the top is sort of right before China entered the WTO, and a couple of decades later, you see the influence China has had on the global sort of economy as well. So a full decoupling, again, is not necessarily in our forecast. It's not something that is in the best interests of anyone, but an increase in the number of regulations, restrictions, and costs is certainly something to be aware of. Next slide. And these last two slides, I'd like to sort of end on sort of a longer term, more positive outlook. It does seem like there's some negative sentiment. We've had a rough past few years, but I think especially in this particular chart, what you see is emerging markets and projected GDP and growth opportunities in different regions. And a lot of it is clustered around, as you see, Southeast Asia, you see the Middle East, Africa, Latin America. And so there are, certainly, annual GDP growth opportunities over sort of the next, couple of decades. So, while we're really focused on this year, what transpired last year, in the next few years, it's important to recognize that there are, future growth opportunities in other parts of the world to be aware of. And next slide. This final slide is sort of a natural extension of that, sort of the G20 or sort of the biggest economies that we see for, where we are today versus 2050. This is clearly, an outsized, extended outlook. But what you see is in our forecast, we do see mainland China still taking over the GDP of the US next decade. It's anticipated to be a little longer than we had thought, maybe just from a few years ago. You see India sort of having moved up the rankings, and you see a lot more Asian economies also moving up the charts. I think what we see in terms of investment from China pivoting to other areas in technology, in green technology, or in green energy rather, in terms of AI, quantum computing. These are also the sort of the growth engines and investment opportunities that we're seeing for companies in other parts of the world as well. And so that's something to sort of take away in terms of having sort of a longer perspective, I think, in terms of where the world is headed economically. So with that, I will hand it over back to Andy. So thank you.
That's great. That's great. Thank you very much to both Rupert and Edward for those very insightful presentations. We've obviously got a little bit of time now for some Q&A. So please do keep the questions coming through for any particular topics that you want to pose to the two presenters. Edward, I'm going to start with you on supply chains. There's a lot going on with supply chains, as highlighted in your presentation, whether it's China Plus strategy, clearly with conflicts and tensions from a geopolitical perspective as well. What impacts do you think we are actually seeing day to day on supply chains? And the second part, how can companies evaluate that risk and strategy and put strategies in place to cope with that?
That's a great question. I think what we've seen, as I sort of touched upon earlier, is that companies have gone through what I would say is an evolution over more than just a decade. This isn't something that sort of happened overnight as a result of sort of, escalating geopolitical risk. We've seen a lot of our members, for example, experience and testimonies that they provided is that, there were, price sensitivity considerations happening years ago. They saw that as China became sort of more sophisticated in terms of its supply chain, that the costs had risen. And so they, as far back as, the, 2010s, for example, looked at, other areas, such as Vietnam, such as Malaysia, Indonesia, et cetera. As they considered wage inflation, they were moving, and diversifying some of their manufacturing processes overseas. Clearly, with the onset of COVID and the pandemic and restrictions in terms of lockdowns and closed manufacturing bases, that accelerated a process that had already been started. And now that you've sort of moved into this area of higher political rhetoric in terms of de-risking and decoupling, you see companies, I guess the most high profile one would be Apple, looking to, diversify its iPhone manufacturing, which had been about 98, 99% in China, moving about 25% of that to India, 25% of their iPad and Apple Watch manufacturing over to Vietnam. And so you see this sort of China plus one, plus two strategy sort of accelerating. And what you're seeing again is sort of this, bifurcation of different competitive blocks emerging as a result. And I think companies, different senior leadership have to sort of take into account, the amount of risk they're willing to sort of take on across their different sort of supply chains, but also be aware that China in and of itself is continues to be a huge market. So as I mentioned, this idea of dual supply chains is taking force, and sort of finding that right ratio and that right balance is going to have sort of an outsized effect on a going forward basis.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the phrases going around at the moment is the next China is China, right? And
right.
Certainly very clear in the presentation around that is still the case, and companies certainly can't ignore China. But linked with that, one of the trends that we are seeing is China companies going more global in terms of whether supply chain and in general from a business perspective. Certainly a trend that we've been seeing across our business, particularly focused on Southeast Asia. So Rupert, when Chinese firms are looking to do this, are looking to expand beyond China, what are the challenges, whether it be in leadership or hiring, that you think companies should be aware of?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question. I think there's a couple of main points with this one. When we talk about the kind of people they're trying to hire, I think the trends are very similar, whether you're trying to hire top talent in the region or whether you're looking to hire it overseas. Everybody's looking for these people who can make a real difference to an organization besides technical skills, potentially people with really positive growth mindset, can-do attitude, people who are creative problem solvers, some of the things we talked about earlier. There's obviously a trend with Chinese firms that are going overseas. They're often looking to attract both Chinese talent to go overseas, but also hire talent locally. I think one of the challenges with this sort of second issue, the hiring local talent in overseas territories, is often the way the recruitment process happens, the way that they position their opportunities potentially is slightly different to how it's done, for example, in mainland. So, one thing that we get involved with a lot in these types of scenarios is helping our domestic Chinese clients understand how they might need to be flexible in how they operate and position themselves as a career opportunity to local talent in overseas markets. So, yeah, they would be the two main points that I'd cite for that one.
Very good, thank you. Edward, one more for you here that's just come through on the chat. I think a very good question. Do you see more trade and economic cooperation between China and the extended BRICS countries because of the decoupling that's happening in the economy?
Another great question. Yeah, I actually do. I think we're seeing trend-wise a lot more cooperation between China and the BRICS, and this idea of sort of the global South competing with the traditional sort of G20 countries. There were a lot of official state visits from officials from Latin America, for example, from Africa, from other areas to China, and vice versa. And what you see is what we've seen is a lot more sort of trade pacts as well. And this idea that a lot of settlement is going to be done in RMB. I think there's been talk of this idea of trying to displace the US dollar as sort of the dominant currency, and RMB as, a probable alternative to that. We don't see that as necessarily feasible, but you do see an ongoing trend of the emergence of the RMB in terms of different trade pacts with its alliance within the context of BRICS. So we see that those ongoing relationships as an opportunity to build a compelling bloc, I would say, headed by China, mainland China, on a going forward basis as well. So it's going to have sort of increasing importance, and I think that also speaks to this idea of, again, sort of bifurcation, this sort of decoupling, and these are sort of all resulting in sort of an emergence of other countries looking to sort of pick up the slack in that capacity.
Yeah, for sure. Come back to a bit more hiring, recruitment related, couple of recruitment related questions now. So one for you, Rupert. How can we identify good candidates in a hiring process? And there's an example where a candidate came across as very experienced in interviews, but in reality found it difficult to solve the business problems that they faced. Any advice for our question asker there?
Yeah, I guess the basic way I'd answer that is the more you invest in a process, the luckier you get. So to give you an example, in a hiring process, from my point of view, there's several components to it. There's how you're searching for these people and accessing a market. There's how you're engaging with them. There's how you're assessing and evaluating them. So a lot of this is about designing an end-to-end process that shifts the odds in your favor of the right result. So to give you an example, if we just take assessment, because that was at the core of that question, there are several components to that. If you look at any given hire, whether it's motivations, whether it's their mindset, their attitude, their behaviors, this idea of ownership, which is a big theme, people that can really solve problems and own them and make a real difference. There's the technical skills. So there's lots of components to what you may want to evaluate. And it's about taking time to really design a process that works. That's obviously what we help our clients do day in, day out. And I think this challenge is only going to get bigger. And the reason for that, although I'm no economist, and maybe Edward would have some thoughts on this, the trend we're seeing at the moment, we've cited earlier that in in Edward's presentation, there's obviously, youth unemployment in mainland has been a bit of a challenge. You've also got an aging population in the region with a lot of people retiring over the next 6-7 years. And so what that's going to create is a talent squeeze around experienced management and executive leadership. So these people that really make a difference are going to get harder and harder to find. So yeah, it's not a straightforward one. And this is obviously why we exist as an organization, to try and help organizations solve those challenges. But time and investment and designing a process. And one last thing I would add is really being open-minded. In a lot of conversations I have with my clients, there's a big difference when they're looking to attract top talent between what they want and what often they actually need. And those two things are sometimes not the same thing. So being open-minded as well would be another point I'd make. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. I'm going to ask a question around AI, and Rupert, I'll start with you on this one, but maybe Edward, put your context on this after Rupert. But the question is, what are the roles that are most likely to be replaced by AI in the coming 3 to 5 years? And then, so that'd be for Rupert, and then maybe Edward, maybe some commentary on the impact of AI across the regional economy that you see happening. So Rupert first.
Yeah, it's a hard question. It might be easier for me to answer what's likely not to be replaced, but I'll try and answer the question. From my point of view, it's obviously going to be those roles that perhaps don't add as much value, that are perhaps more repetitive, administrative by nature. The opposite end of the spectrum, the ones that it's unlikely to replace. So again, coming back to these creative problem solvers, these people, particularly in leadership positions, who can really make a difference. So yeah, that's how I try and answer it. But I think it's a very difficult one to predict at the moment. Maybe Edward's got some thoughts on this one.
We're certainly still at a very early stage with regards to generative AI. I mean, AI has been around actually for decades, and we've seen it proliferate in areas that we may not necessarily even be aware of. I think it's had a large impact in terms of robotics, certainly in terms of generative AI, in terms of supply chains, for example. It's had also an outsized effect in terms of really coming up with alternative routes should something happen, especially during pandemic, when there were a lot of bottlenecks in places like mainland China, for example. But as Rupert mentioned, I think when you talk about the future impact of generative AI on the workforce, it's going to immediately sort of probably have the greatest impact on areas that deal with a lot of sort of grunt work, administrative work, for example. We have a sort of more positive outlook with regards to generative AI. We see it as a tool that will certainly help in terms of to help sort of complement a lot of those in the workforce. And so it is sort of very difficult to predict, I think, in terms of software programming. It's going to help sort of facilitate a lot of that area as well. One area in terms of longer term, to go back to your comments on demographics, with declining demographics, it's going to be increasingly more difficult to find talent to sort of replace those that are sort of aging out and retiring. But generative AI and AI in general could help create levels of efficiency and pragmatism in that area. And so while certainly immigration policies could help in terms of declining demographics, AI is an area that I think people aren't necessarily paying as much of attention on, that could have an outsized impact with regards to the workforce and declining demographics there as well.
Great. I might have gone a bit dark. I'm in India at the moment. It looks like we've got a power cut, so hopefully you can still see and hear me. Right, go. Just come back on again. Yeah, I would just like to add something on this as well. I think for AI, I think what we find generally across the region, linking in with what Rupert said, the more junior positions are significantly more likely to be replaced by AI. And the more senior you get and the more people focused the roles are, the less likely that would be. And a phrase that I quite like, that I've seen quite often is, you may not get replaced by AI, but you may get replaced by someone who can use it more effectively than you. So I think advice is to personally invest and make sure you're using the capabilities of it where relevant in your day-to-day work life is good advice for sure. Another question that came through, again linked in with this more mature, maybe retired or semi-retired part of the population. We know there's going to be over the years difficulty in finding talent, and possibly that group of people towards the end, or maybe just past the end of their careers, is a great talent pool to tap into. Rupert, what opportunities do you see there for the individuals, and possibly even that companies can do more of to tap into this pool of talent?
Yeah, look, potentially this one fits into the issue about what organizations think they want and sometimes what they might need. And I'd agree, there's obviously going to be a bunch of people that are later in their careers who have a wealth of experience, that have the capability to make a difference and create opportunities for organizations. And again, it links back to this idea of being open-minded in your talent planning. So yeah, look, I agree. It's definitely an opportunity for organizations to take advantage of, perhaps more so than they have done over the last decade.
Okay, great. Edward, I want to come back to you around US elections. I know you touched on this. We assume Trump v. Biden, not 100% confirmed yet, but I think we assume that's what we're looking at. And I think you highlighted that possibly within China, Trump would maybe be the more favored winner of that for the greater China region. Could you just expand a bit more on that in terms of some of the detail on that and what factors are at play there?
Yeah, it's certainly going to be a very sort of interesting year. We do forecast, as most people have, that it'll be sort of a rematch between Biden and Trump, and so we've seen pockets of obviously with a full administration under Trump, what his policies may be. I think it's fair to say that should he get reelected, and I think coming out of Davos, for example, a lot of business leaders are anticipating a Trump presidency. It would certainly be a reversal of existing trade policies, for example. And then on the geopolitical stage, you could see a huge reversal in a lot of the, and having a huge impact in places like the Ukraine. Maybe not so much in the Middle East, but just his relationships we've seen have been, on the polar opposite end of what the Democratic Party led by Biden has been. So, difficult to say. It's still early days, but the trade, the political impact, in just terms of pushing the sort of Republican agenda to its other extreme under another Trump presidency would have sort of an outsized impact. And so, I don't know if there's a sort of particular area that you sort of want to go into, but I think in terms of the business community, hope, I've heard some say that hope is not necessarily a strategy, that they sort of have to anticipate. And I think the sentiment is that it's going to be a challenging year, just because there is so much, not knowing who's going to sort of be the next president. And so it might put a damper in terms of business expansion, because you invest on one side and the other side sort of wins out. It could sort of hurt your sort of investment strategy there. So it's going to be sort of a challenging year, and to sort of place your bets on one side or the other.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be fascinating watching it all unfold. Second last question before I give you all a chance to just finish off with one last one. So to you, Rupert, I think I'm sure we've got some job seekers on the call, or maybe some people who would consider looking for a new role over this year. Rupert, how could someone really differentiate themselves in this market in order to win an employer over when they're applying for a role?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's I'd answer this in two parts. One is, how do you differentiate yourself through a hiring process? But there's also, how do you then really live up to that when you onboard into a new organization? And it's going to come back to all the things we talked about. It's being honest with oneself about what your strengths are, what your areas for development are, and actually owning that and taking action on those things, playing to those strengths and working on those areas for development. And ultimately, self-awareness, self-discipline, having a positive mindset. It's the old can-do attitude. That's right now what employers are really looking for, and just being honest with oneself about, do I have that? And if you do, great. If sometimes you don't, it's about, then what do I need to do to invest in myself to really change that? Attitude right now is everything, and really owning problems and being able to deliver against those for an employer.
Yeah, agree. So one last question for each of you. Out of everything that we've heard and you've expertly presented today, what would be the one key theme that concerns you for 2024? Edward first.
I've touched upon a bunch of them. I think generative AI, keeping an eye on that, certainly. Increasing sort of economic fragmentation in a more bifurcated world. But I think going back to, I mentioned more than half the global population is going to have some form of elections. So the one we're certainly most keeping an eye on is the US, but there are repercussions on a local, depending on where you are, in regional basis, based on different elections. But just to one last word on the US presidential election. I think certainly the whole sort of the whole dynamic of the U.S. as sort of the global leader in terms of different global conflicts and as an economic powerhouse could be upended. I think, talking about if the possibility of a second Trump presidency or administration were to come on board, you would find, I think, that the U.S. would become a lot more isolationist in terms of its policy overseas. And that would, again, sort of have an outsized effect in terms of, how emerging countries in other parts of the world could have, a greater role and impact in terms of, economic repercussions as well. So certainly, I think the U.S. presidential election, as well as sort of more regional elections, depending on which part of the world you're in, are things that I'm most keeping an eye on.
Thank you, Edward. Rupert, very briefly, your one key theme?
Uncertainty. I think that's what probably would keep me up at night, and back to the presentation, any of those executives that we interviewed. And I think it just highlights the point, if you're in the business world right now, there is a lot of uncertainty, and maybe it's not about spending too much time worrying about that, but just trying to focus on what are the things that you can control. I think is really the big thing.
Yeah, I agree. Well, great. Thank you so much to both of you for those fantastic presentations and insights to the questions. Thank you to all of you for joining us. I trust it was worth your while, and you leave this webinar with some very useful information that can help you in your roles and within your business. We really value feedback. So before leaving, if you could just complete a small survey so we understand what you think about the webinar, and it will help us to do better next time. So please scan the QR code that is going to come up on the screen and send us any feedback. But just to say thank you so much. Have a great day and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.